The rain in Charleston, West Virginia comes down sideways in the spring. It doesn't fall so much as it slants in from the river, gray and cold and full of the smell of coal dust that has soaked into the stones of that city for 150 years. On a Tuesday morning in March of 2024, a young woman stood under the awning of a closed shoe store on Capitol Street and watched it come down. She was 22 years old. Her name was Hazel Crane. She had $10 folded into the inside pocket of a denim jacket that wasn't quite warm enough, a backpack that held everything she still owned, and nowhere in particular to go. She wasn't crying. She had stopped crying a long time ago. Crying was for people who still believed somebody might come along and ask what was wrong. Hazel had learned by the time she was 19 that nobody was coming. Not in the way the movies promised. People in this part of the country were too tired to come for anybody. They were holding on to their own lives with both hands. And if you slipped quietly. And the world kept moving. She watched a man in a brown coat run from a parked truck to the diner across the street, holding a newspaper over his head. She watched the traffic light change from red to green and back to red without a single car going through. She watched a stray dog cross the intersection, slow and deliberate like he had somewhere to be and was not going to let the rain change his mind about it. Hazel had been born in a trailer off Route 60, 22 miles east of where she was standing. The trailer was the color of weak coffee and had a screen door that squeaked no matter how much WD-40 her father put on the hinges. Her father's name was Travis Crane. He was a man of few words and large hands. He drove a delivery truck for a beverage distributor for as long as Hazel could remember. And on Sunday afternoons, he would sit on the cinder block step outside the trailer and smoke one cigarette, just one, as if it were a ration he had to make last. He would look out at the gravel lot and the rusted basketball hoop nailed to a telephone pole and the chain-link fence at the end of the row, and he would not say anything for an hour. Hazel used to sit beside him and try to see what he was seeing. She never could. He died when she was 14, a heart attack on a Wednesday afternoon in the cab of his delivery truck in the parking lot of a grocery store outside Beckley. The grocery store manager found him slumped over the steering wheel with the radio still playing a country song. The doctor said he had probably been dead for about 20 minutes by the time anyone noticed. He was 61 years old. He had never said a word about his own father. He had never said a word about where he came from. He had brought himself into the world of Travis Crane, the husband, and Travis Crane, the delivery man. And he had let the rest go silent behind him, like a door closing. Her mother, Margaret, had been the one who held the family together after that. She waitressed at a truck stop on the edge of Charleston, the kind of place where the coffee was always too hot, and the menu had not changed since 1989. She came home smelling like bacon grease and cigarette smoke from other people's tables. She raised Hazel and her younger sister Lily on tips and prayer, and the stubborn refusal to be the woman who gave up. She did this for 6 years. And then her heart, which had carried too much for too long, simply stopped one night in the kitchen halfway through pouring a glass of water. Hazel found her in the morning. She was 20 years old. That was 2 years ago. The rain on Capitol Street kept coming. Hazel pulled the hood of her jacket tighter and felt the $10 bill in her pocket through the fabric, the way a man at sea might feel for the shape of a compass. $10. It was all she had. She had been moving for 2 months, riding buses, sleeping in stations, washing her face in the bathrooms of gas stations off the interstate. And the $10 had been her one constant. She would not spend it. She did not know why. Some superstition maybe that if she let go of it, she would let go of the last thread connecting her to the person she had been before the trailer was repossessed, and the world had unwritten her address. A bus hissed by on the wet pavement. Across the street, the diner's neon sign flickered the letter O, stuttering on and off. Hazel watched her own reflection in the dark glass of the closed shoe store. A thin girl with brown hair plastered to her forehead, a jacket that had been her mother's, a backpack that had been her father's, a face that did not yet look like the face of someone who had given up, but was beginning to consider the option. She did not know it yet, standing there in the cold March rain with the river running gray behind her, and the city of Charleston going on with its mourning. She did not know that she was about to spend that $10 bill on something nobody else wanted in a place she had never heard of. She did not know that what waited for her at the end of an abandoned railroad track in the hills of Summers County was a man she had never met, a name she had never been told, and a debt of love that had been waiting 45 years for somebody to come and collect it. She just stood there in the rain, and the river kept running, and the world, as it always does, kept moving. The truck stop sat at the bottom of a long curve on Route 66, miles east of the Charleston city limits, and it had been there since 1972. The man who owned it was named Buck Holloway. He was 65 years old, with a face like weathered cedar, and hands that looked like they had been carved out of the same wood. He wore a flannel shirt every day of the year, even in August, and he kept his hair cut short, the way he had kept it cut short for 50 years, ever since he was a boy, in a coal town up the holler called Cabin Creek. Buck did not say much. When he did say something, people leaned in to hear it, not because he was loud, but because he was not. He was a man who had learned somewhere along the road that words were a kind of currency, and that the people who spent them carelessly went broke. Buck had known Margaret Crane for 19 years. She had walked into the truck stop in 2003 with a baby on her hip and asked if there was any work. And Buck had looked at her the way he looked at engines that needed fixing, and he had said yes. She had worked for him until the day she died. She never missed a shift. She never asked for a raise. She did her job the way her own mother had done her job, the way every woman in that part of the country did her job, with a kind of grim dignity that the rest of America had stopped knowing how to recognize. When Margaret died, Hazel had walked into the truck stop on a cold Tuesday morning, 20 years old, hollow-eyed, and asked Buck if she could borrow $1,800 to bury her mother. She had said it like that, just the number, no story, no apology. She had not known how to ask for anything in her life. Buck had looked at her for a long time. Then he had walked into the back office and he had come out with an envelope. He had not counted the money. He had handed her the envelope and he had said, $20 a month out of your paycheck, no interest. That was all. He had not asked her how she was doing. He had not put a hand on her shoulder. Buck Holloway was not that kind of man. But the envelope had been heavier than $1,800. Hazel had felt the weight of it walking out of the truck stop. and she had understood that some kinds of kindness do not announce themselves. She paid him back over 9 months, $20 at a time. She bussed tables and washed dishes and stocked the cooler with single bottles of Mountain Dew. And on the last day of October in 2022, she walked into Buck's office and laid the final $20 bill on his desk. Buck looked at the bill. He looked at her. He did not pick the money up. He sat behind that desk for what must have been 30 seconds without saying anything. The fluorescent light overhead made a faint humming sound. The kind of sound that fills a room when nobody is talking and somebody is thinking about saying something they have been holding for a long time. Then he said, "Your mother was a strong woman." Hazel nodded. She did not trust her voice. Buck looked down at the desk. His big hands were folded in front of him. The knuckles of his right hand had a scar across them, white and raised from something that had happened a long time ago. He said, "There's things she meant to tell you, things she made me promise to keep quiet about until you were old enough to hear them." Hazel felt the room tilt slightly. She said, "Tell me now." Buck shook his head, slowly, with the gravity of a man who had taken oaths in his life and meant them. "It's not time," he said. "She told me I'd know when. I don't know yet." Hazel opened her mouth, but no words came out. She wanted to argue. She wanted to demand. She wanted to shake him by the collar of that flannel shirt and pull whatever it was out of him, because she had nothing left in the world, and she could not afford to have anything else hidden from her. But Buck Holloway was not a man you shook. He was a stone wall in human form, and the wall had been built by promises he had kept for 65 years, and he was not going to take it down for anybody. Not even her. She walked out of the office. She walked out of the truck stop. She drove home in her mother's old Buick, which would itself break down 2 weeks later and never run again. She sat in the trailer and looked at the ceiling for a long time. She thought about the envelope. She thought about Buck's hands and the scar, and the way he had said the word time like it weighed 100 pounds. She did not know it then, but she would think about that conversation many nights over the next year. She would think about it in the trailer when the heat went out, and at the truck stop when she worked late shifts, and on the kitchen floor of the trailer the night she opened the second eviction notice and read it 3 times by the light of a lamp that was about to run out of bulb. She would think about Buck Holloway and his promise, and she would not understand what he meant. Not for a long time. Not until she had walked deeper into the woods than she had ever walked in her life and stood in front of a door that had not been opened in 45 years and learned that the silence of certain old men is not absence. It is a covenant. And the covenants of old men, the real ones, are not broken even by death. The eviction notice was taped to the door of the trailer on a Friday afternoon in early January, 15 months after she had paid off the last $20 of the burial debt. Hazel had been working a double at the truck stop, and she came home in the dark and saw the white paper before she saw anything else. It was the kind of paper you recognize before you read it. The shape of bad news has its own posture in the world. She stood on the cinder block step where her father used to smoke his Sunday cigarette, and she read the notice 3 times. And then she folded it in half and put it in her pocket and went inside and made herself a cup of instant coffee. 3 days. That was what the paper said. She had 3 days to vacate the property. The bank had owned the trailer since her mother died, and Hazel had been paying what she could. But what she could had not been enough. And the patience of banks runs out faster than the patience of the people who owe them. They had given her every grace they could give. The grace had finally run out. She spent the first day going through her mother's things. There was not much. Margaret had not been a woman who kept things. She had a small wooden jewelry box on the top of the dresser that contained a wedding ring, a pair of pearl earrings that had belonged to her own mother, and a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a recipe for biscuits in handwriting Hazel didn't recognize. She took the ring. She took the earrings. She left the recipe. There was a closet in the back bedroom that her mother had used for storage, boxes of Christmas decorations, a pair of work boots that had belonged to Travis, a garbage bag full of old photographs that Hazel had never been allowed to look through, because every time she had asked, that Margaret had said, "Not now, baby. Some other time." And then time had run out. Hazel pulled the garbage bag onto the floor of the bedroom and sat cross-legged on the worn carpet and untied the knot. The photographs spilled out in a small avalanche of paper and faded color. School pictures of herself and Lily, Polaroids from the trailer park summers, a wedding photo of her parents standing in front of a brown courthouse, her mother in a yellow dress, her father in a blue shirt with the collar slightly too big for his neck. Pictures of Hazel as a baby in a plastic kiddie pool in the front yard. The whole short museum of an ordinary American life. And then, near the bottom of the bag, in a separate envelope, yellowed with age, she found a single black and white photograph that did not belong with the others. It was an old photograph. The corners were soft from handling. The image was sharp and clear. A man in his late 50s, lean and weathered, wearing a railroad cap and a canvas work jacket, standing in front of an enormous railroad car. The car was a Pullman sleeper, the heavy old kind from before the war, with a rounded roof and steel sides and a long row of windows running down the length of it. The paint looked dark. The man was not smiling exactly, but his hand was resting on the side of the railroad car, flat-palmed the way a man rests his hand on the shoulder of someone he loves. Hazel turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting she had never seen before in faded blue ink, were 3 words and a year. Talcott, June 1981. She sat on the floor of the empty bedroom and held the photograph for a long time. She did not know who the man was. She did not know what Talcott was. She had never heard the name. The handwriting did not belong to her mother. It did not belong to her father. It belonged to somebody else. Somebody who had stood in front of that railroad car 43 years ago and written the location and the date on the back of a photograph, and then somehow sent it across the years in the silence and the closed doors of her family until it landed in her hands on the last day she would ever spend in the only home she had ever known. She did not understand what it meant, but she put the photograph in the front pocket of her backpack. She zipped the pocket carefully. She zipped it twice the way you double-check a lock on a door when you know what is on the other side matters more than you can yet say. That was the first thing. The second thing was a voice in her head, soft but clear, that she had not heard before in her life. It said, "Find him." She did not know who him was. She did not know who the voice was. She only knew that something inside her had been waiting for a long time to wake up, and that the photograph had woken it. She left the trailer the next morning with a backpack on her shoulders, a denim jacket on her back, $38 in her pocket, and a black and white photograph of a man she had never met, standing in front of a railroad car in a town she had never heard of. She did not know where she was going, but for the first time in her life, she knew she was going somewhere. There is a kind of person, and you have known them, who can disappear inside the country itself, not run away from it, not flee, just step into the long machinery of buses and rest stops and gas station coffee and let the whole moving body of America carry them for a while. Hazel Crane became that kind of person in the first weeks of 2024. She did not have a plan. She had a backpack and a photograph, and a few $100s she had managed to save from the truck stop in the last weeks before the trailer went. She rode buses. She rode them the way men used to ride freight trains. She rode them because she could not bear to stay still. Standing still meant thinking. Thinking meant remembering. Remembering meant the trailer and the cemetery and the kitchen floor where she had found her mother. So she moved. Huntington, Beckley, Bluefield, Pikeville, Kentucky for one strange afternoon. Back across the state line. Roanoke, Virginia. Greyhound stations in the dead hours of the night. 2 a.m., 3 a.m., when the only people in the waiting room were the kinds of people who did not have any other place to be. Hazel learned the geography of being invisible. She learned which seats in a bus station to sit in so that the security guards would leave her alone. She learned to pull her hood low. She learned to keep her backpack between her feet so that when she dozed off, she would feel any movement against it. She learned to wash her hair in the sink of a pilot truck stop bathroom in 15 minutes and walk out looking like a young woman who was simply traveling, not a young woman who had nowhere to go. She ate from vending machines. She drank coffee that tasted like the inside of the machine. She read paperback books that other people had left behind on bus seats. And when she finished one, she would leave it for the next person. She read Louis L'Amour. She read John D. MacDonald. She read a battered copy of The Old Man and the Sea twice in 2 days. She did not call her sister Lily, who was 19 years old and lived in Ohio with their mother's sister, and who had her own difficult life. She did not call Buck Holloway, whose number she still had memorized because she did not want him to know what she had become. She called nobody. She was for those long weeks a young woman with no one to call. And she discovered the way every traveler eventually discovers that having no one to call is not the same as having no one. There are still strangers. There is still the kindness that occasionally passes between two human beings who happen to share a bench at 4 a.m. and have nothing to say to each other, but somehow say it. In the second month of moving on a Wednesday in late February in the Huntington bus station at 1:30 in the morning, a man with a face the color of old bourbon sat down next to her and started talking. He was drunk. His words came at a slant. He said something Hazel did not hear, and then he said it again. And then his hand reached for her arm. She pulled away. He pulled back harder. And then, from somewhere across the waiting room, an older woman said very loudly, "Sir," just that one word. "Sir." The drunk man froze. He turned his head. The older woman was already walking toward them. She was maybe 70 years old, gray hair pulled back in a knot, a pale blue coat buttoned to the throat. She walked the way school teachers used to walk in the days when a school teacher could clear a hallway with her eyes. She said, "Sir, you're going to walk away now." The drunk man considered. The drunk man, perhaps in some flicker of an older instinct, recognized the voice his mother used to use. He stood up. He walked away. He did not look back. The older woman sat down beside Hazel. She did not say anything for a long time. She just sat there. Then she opened her purse and she took out a small pocket Bible, the kind they used to give out at weddings in the 1960s. Leather-bound, gold-edged soft, from a half-century of being carried. She pressed it into Hazel's hand. "My name is Edith," she said. "I'm not a religious person exactly. I just always carried this. My husband gave it to me. He's been gone 14 years. Hazel did not know what to say. Edith looked at her. Her eyes were very pale, the color of weak tea. She said, "You've got something in that backpack you're carrying somewhere. I can tell. People who are running from something carry it different than people who are running towards something." Hazel did not answer, but her hand went instinctively to the front pocket of her backpack, to the photograph. Edith nodded as if Hazel had spoken. She said, "Some things we think we've lost are just waiting for the right person to come find them." Then she stood up. She picked up her purse. She walked across the waiting room and out into the cold Huntington night, and Hazel never saw her again. The Bible stayed in Hazel's hand. She would carry it for the rest of her life. She did not become a religious person exactly, but she carried it. That was a Wednesday morning. 2 days later, on a bus from Huntington East toward Hinton, Hazel Crane heard a conversation that would change everything. The bus left Huntington at 6:15 in the morning, and the sky was the color of an old nickel. Hazel had bought her ticket with the last of her cash, a one-way to Hinton, because Hinton was the next town on the route, and the next town was as far as she could think. She was wearing her denim jacket and her mother's sweater under it. She had eaten a granola bar and drunk a coffee from a vending machine. She was by the standards of her last weeks doing fine. She took a seat near the back on the right side by the window. The bus filled up halfway and pulled out. The road east out of Huntington follows the Ohio River for a while, and then turns inland through hills that look like the spines of sleeping animals, low and long, and covered in winter trees. Hazel watched the country go by. She did not read. She did not sleep. She just watched. 2 men got on at a stop in Charleston and sat in the seat directly in front of her. They were the kind of men you do not see anymore in most parts of America, but you still see in West Virginia. They wore work boots that had been worked in. They wore flannel shirts that had been washed 1,000 times. Their hands, when they rested on the seat backs, were thick and scarred and stained around the nails with the kind of stain that does not come off. One of them had a beard streaked with gray. The other had a Carhartt cap pushed back on his head. They were maybe 50 years old. They were maybe 60. With men like that, you could not always tell. They started talking the way men like that talk about nothing in particular. The price of diesel. A football game from the weekend. A brother-in-law who had bought a tractor. Hazel did not pay attention at first. The voices were just part of the bus, like the hum of the engine and the rattle of a loose panel near the rear axle. But then the bearded one said something quieter than the rest, and the word came through the back of his seat into her ear. He said, "Salvage." She did not know why she heard it. She did not know why that one word lifted itself out of all the other words and reached her. But she leaned forward just slightly in her seat, and she listened. "They're auctioning the rest of it Saturday," the bearded one said. "Up in Summers County. The railroad's been clearing out the old equipment for years. Most of it went already. There's a few pieces left." "Anything worth driving up for?" said the one with the cap. "Nah, mostly junk. Wheel sets, old switching gear. They got one whole Pullman sleeper sitting on a dead spur outside Talcott. Been there since '78. Nobody'll touch it. The metal alone would be worth something for scrap, but you'd never get it out of there. The track's overgrown for 2 miles. The cap one made a sound like a laugh. "Pullman sleeper from when? 46, heavyweight, riveted steel sides. Beautiful old thing if you like that kind of thing." "What's the asking?" The bearded one paused. He shifted in his seat. The vinyl creaked. $10, he said. Hazel's hand stopped on the strap of her backpack. The cap one laughed longer this time. $10? Railroad just wants it off the books. They've been listing it for 8 months. No bidders. The county clerk in Hinton will write you the paper if you walk in with a $10 bill. You also get the right to sit on the 200 feet of dead track it's parked on. That track belongs to a rail company that don't exist no more. It's all just up there in the woods rotting back into the hill. Ain't worth the gas to go look. That's what everybody says. That's why it's still $10. They moved on to talking about a high school football game. Their voices receded. The bus rattled down the highway and the hills slid past the window. And Hazel Crane sat very still in her seat, with her hand on the strap of her backpack, and her heart doing something it had not done in 2 months. She unzipped the front pocket of the backpack with one finger. Slowly. Quietly. She pulled the photograph out into her lap and held it where the men in front of her could not see it. A man in a railroad cap, standing in front of a Pullman sleeper. The dark paint, the riveted sides, the long row of windows. Talcott, June 1981. She turned the photograph over. She turned it back. She looked at the railroad car in the picture, and she thought about what the bearded man had just said. They got one whole Pullman sleeper sitting on a dead spur outside Talcott. Been there since '78. The photograph had been taken 3 years after the car had stopped moving. Hazel put the photograph back in the front pocket of her backpack. She zipped the pocket. She zipped it twice. When the bus reached Hinton, she got off. She did not buy another ticket. She did not look for another bus. She stood on the sidewalk in front of the Greyhound station in Hinton, West Virginia, with $10 in her pocket and a photograph she could no longer pretend was a coincidence. And she looked at the town in front of her, and she understood the way you understand certain things only once or twice in a life that she was no longer running. She was being called. The Summers County Clerk's office was 3 blocks from the bus station, in an old brick building with a green metal roof and a flag hanging limp outside the door. The flag was an American flag. The pole was painted white. The sidewalk in front of the building was cracked from 100 winters of freeze and thaw, and a dandelion was already growing through one of the cracks, even though it was still February. Hazel walked in. The waiting room smelled like floor wax and old paper. and the faint tang of the kerosene heater somebody had running in the back office. There were 2 molded plastic chairs and a counter with a sliding glass window. A bell sat on the counter. Hazel rang the bell. A woman came out from the back. She was in her late 40s with a careful gray streak in her dark hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. Her nameplate said Laverne. She looked at Hazel with the quiet professional patience of a woman who had been signing papers for the public since 1996 and had seen every kind of person walk through that door. She said, "Help you." Hazel said, "I'd like to bid on the Pullman car, the one outside Talcott." Laverne's expression did not change, but something in her eyes did. The smallest flicker. The kind of look a clerk gets when an item on a list that has been on the list for years is suddenly being taken off. She said, "That's been listed 8 months. You sure?" "Yes, ma'am. Minimum bid is $10. Hazel laid the bill on the counter. It was the same bill she had been carrying for almost half a year. The corners were soft. The crease down the middle was permanent now. It had been folded in the pocket of her jacket for so long that the crease had begun to wear through the paper. Laverne picked up the $10 bill. She looked at it. She looked at Hazel. She did not move for a moment. "Honey," she said, "you understand there's no road access. It's a mile walk in, no power, no water, no nothing." "I understand." "And you understand you're buying it as is. Whatever's in it, whatever shape it's in, that's your problem now." "I understand." Laverne nodded slowly. She turned to her computer. She typed for a minute. The printer in the back office began to chatter. A page came out. She slid the page across the counter and tapped a line at the bottom with her pen. "Sign here. Print your name underneath." Hazel signed. Then she printed her name in block letters. Hazel Crane. Laverne picked up the page. She had been about to put it in a folder. She did not put it in the folder. She held it in her hand and read the name. She read it again. She looked up. She said very carefully, "Crane, yes ma'am." Like Walter Crane. The room went very still. Hazel did not understand the question for a moment. She had to play the words back in her head. Like Walter Crane. As if the name were a known quantity. As if it had been hanging on the wall of this small county clerk's office for years, gathering dust, waiting for somebody to ask about it. She said, "I don't know who that is." Laverne stared at her. "Honey," she said. The word came out softer this time. Walter Crane was the last man named Crane in Talcott. He died in 2003. He worked the C&O Railroad his whole life. Lived alone in a little house at the end of Birch Lane. I just figured that name was gone. Hazel did not move. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips. "How old was he?" she said. It came out flat. Not a question. A request for information. Laverne looked down at the paper. She looked up. 83 when he passed. Born 1920, I believe. He was a regular at the diner up the street for 40 years. Came in every Saturday morning for coffee. Never said much. Quiet old fellow. Hazel felt the floor tilt very slightly under her feet. She put one hand on the counter to steady herself. She said, "Did he have a son?" Laverne's eyes narrowed. Just a little. The way the eyes of a small-town clerk narrow when she has spent her whole career in a building that contains the records of every birth and every death and every property transfer in a county of 15,000 people. And she suddenly sees a connection she had not seen before. She said slowly, "He had a boy. Long time ago. The boy left when he was just a teenager. 71, 72, somewhere in there. Walter never talked about him. Most folks figured the boy was dead." Hazel could not speak. Travis Crane had been 17 years old in 1972. He had run away from somewhere. He had never said where. He had built his entire life out of the silence of where he had come from. Walter Crane had been a man in his 50s when his only son disappeared. He had lived another 31 years. He had died alone in a house at the end of a road in a town his granddaughter had never heard of. He had left no family behind. As far as anyone in Summers County knew, the line ended with him. Until now. Laverne was looking at Hazel the way you look at a ghost, when the ghost is not yet aware of being one. She said very gently, "Are you all right, honey?" Hazel pulled the photograph out of her backpack. She laid it on the counter face up. Laverne looked at it. She looked at Hazel. She looked at the photograph again. She said, "That's Walter." She said it the way you say the name of a person you have known for a long time and not seen for a long time and never expected to see again. She slid the photograph back across the counter to Hazel. She did not say anything else for a moment. Then she picked up Hazel's signed paper and she put it in the folder. And she pulled out a deed and stamped it. And she handed the deed across the counter. "Welcome to Summers County, Miss Crane," she said. "Talcott's about 10 miles east. You go down Route 3 along the river. You can't miss the old spur. It's in the woods past the Big Bend tunnel marker. Take the gravel road behind the gate." Hazel took the deed. She took the photograph. She took her backpack. She walked out of the clerk's office into a cold February afternoon in a town she had never been to before, holding in her hands the only proof she had ever been given that her family had a history and a place and a name that meant something to somebody besides herself. Route 3 follows the New River out of Hinton through a valley so narrow in places that the sky overhead is just a long blue ribbon between the ridges. The river runs deep and green and very fast. It has been running through that valley for longer than anyone can imagine, longer than there were people in the country, longer than there were countries. And it does not particularly care about the small affairs of the people who live along its banks. Hazel walked east along the shoulder of the road, with her backpack on her shoulders, and the deed folded in the inside pocket of her jacket, and she felt the river pulling her forward the way a current pulls a small boat. She walked for nearly 2 hours. A few pickup trucks passed her going the other way. One of them slowed down, and a man in a brown coat leaned out the window and asked if she needed a ride, and she shook her head. She was not afraid of him. He was a farmer with kind eyes. She just needed to walk. She needed her feet to do this. She needed each step to belong to her. The road crossed the river on a long iron bridge with green-painted girders. Hazel stopped in the middle of the bridge and looked down. The water below was the color of a bottle dark green where the rocks lay deep and silver, where the surface caught the afternoon light. She could see the round stones on the river bottom polished smooth by 1,000 years of current. The bridge hummed faintly under her feet from the pressure of the water. She stood there for a long time. A man named Walter Crane had stood somewhere along this same river, almost certainly decades before. A young Walter coming home from a war. A middle-aged Walter walking to work at the rail yard. An old Walter, the man in the photograph with his lined face and his canvas jacket standing in front of his railroad car. He had walked these roads. He had crossed this bridge. He had looked down at this same river and seen the same green water, and the river had not cared about him either. But the river had been here for him, the way it was here for her. There is something in old men in this part of the country. You have known some of them. You may be one yourself. They do not say very much. They put in their hours. They keep their word. They build something quietly, brick by brick, a piece at a time. And most of the time nobody notices, and they do it anyway. And then one day they are gone, and what they have built is still standing, and some young person who never knew them walks up to it and puts a hand on the wall and feels the warmth of all those years. Hazel did not know any of this yet. She only knew that she was walking. She walked off the bridge. She walked another mile. She passed a green sign that said, Talcott Pop 312. She walked past a post office, a church with a white steeple, a volunteer fire department in a cinder block building, and a half-dozen houses with wood smoke rising from their chimneys. A historical marker stood at the edge of the town. She slowed down to look at it. The marker was a tall metal sign painted brown and white, and it told the story of John Henry, the steel-driving man, who had raced a steam drill through the heart of the Big Bend Tunnel in 1870 and had won, and had died with his hammer in his hand. Hazel read the marker once all the way through. She thought about a man dying with his hammer in his hand. She thought about her father, who had died with his hands on a steering wheel. She thought about Walter Crane, who had died alone in a house on Birch Lane after waiting 31 years for his son to come home. She kept walking. About a mile past Talcott, on the right side of the road, a gravel track turned off the highway and went up between two stands of oak and hickory. There was a rusted gate across the track with a chain on it, but the chain was loose and the lock had been broken so long ago. The metal was the color of the rust around it. Beyond the gate, a narrow path led off into the woods, and Hazel could see faintly the ghost of an old railroad bed. Two rails half buried in dirt and leaves, ties rotted, but holding their shape ferns growing between them. She stood at the gate for a moment. The afternoon was cold and bright. The shadows of the bare trees moved on the gravel in long, thin shapes. From somewhere deep in the woods, a crow called. Then another. Then silence. Hazel pushed the gate open. The hinge gave a small, dry sound. She stepped through. She walked into the woods on the old rail bed. The trees closed in over her head. The light went green and dim. The air, even in February, smelled different in there, of moss and wet leaves and old iron and something else she could not name, something faintly sweet. The smell that woods have when they have been left alone for a long time and have begun to remember what they were before. She walked for 10 minutes. The path bent around a low ridge, and then between the trees she saw it. The Pullman car was sitting at the end of the track in a small clearing where the woods opened up just enough to let the afternoon light come down. It was longer than she had imagined, 80 feet of riveted steel, with a rounded roof and a long row of windows and a vestibule door at the near end, with the steps folded down into the weeds. The dark green paint was almost gone. Rust ran in long streaks down the sides. The whole car was being slowly reclaimed by the forest. Kudzu twined around the bumper at the far end. Ivy crept up one wall. A young maple was growing 6 feet from the side of the car and would in another 20 years lean against it. Hazel stopped on the path. The railroad car was enormous and silent and completely still. It sat in the clearing the way a stone sits in a riverbed, the way something that has stopped moving sits when it has been still for so long. That stillness has become part of what it is. It was the railroad car in the photograph. The one Walter Crane had stood in front of in June of 1981, with his hand on the side of it, the way a man rests his hand on the shoulder of someone he loves. Hazel walked the last 30 yards through the weeds. She climbed the iron vestibule steps. The metal under her boots was cold and rang faintly. She put her hand on the door. She pushed. It opened. The inside of the Pullman car smelled like a building that had been holding its breath for 45 years. It was a long, narrow corridor running the length of the car, with sleeping compartments opening off it on both sides. The walls were paneled in dark mahogany, dulled by decades of dust but undamaged. The ceiling was arched and lined with the same wood. Small brass light fixtures, tarnished green, hung at intervals down the corridor. The carpet underfoot was worn to threads in the middle, but still bright at the edges, a deep red pattern of scrolls and leaves that had been chosen by some Pullman designer a lifetime ago. The air was cool. The air was still. The air had not been disturbed in so long that Hazel could feel her own breath as a separate thing inside it. She walked the corridor slowly. She looked into each compartment. There were 12 of them, 6 on each side. Each compartment had a folding bench seat that would have, in the old days, opened down into a sleeping berth. The upholstery was rotten. The wood beneath was solid. The brass fittings on the doors had not been polished since the Carter administration, but had not been stolen either. The car had not been vandalized. The car had not been broken into. The car had simply been left. Hazel reached the end of the corridor. There was a door. It was the only door in the railroad car that did not belong. The other compartment doors were wood lacquered dark with brass handles. The door at the end of the corridor was steel, heavy steel. Painted gray with a brush, the brushstrokes still visible. It had been welded into a steel frame that had been welded into the original wooden bulkhead of the car. The work was rough. It was the work of a man who knew how to weld and did not care whether the weld was pretty. He cared whether it would hold. The door had a deadbolt. Hazel tried the handle. The deadbolt was thrown. She stood looking at the door for a long minute. She did not have a key. She did not know what was on the other side. She knew only that whoever had welded that door into that car had wanted to keep something either in or out, and that the thing on the other side, whatever it was, had not been touched in a long time. She went back outside. She walked around the car. She found a piece of rebar in the weeds about as long as her forearm, and she carried it back inside. She crouched in front of the steel door and looked at the hinges. The hinges were on the corridor side. She thought about that for a moment. A man who is hiding something inside a room does not usually put the hinges on the outside. He puts them on the inside where you cannot get to the pins. The hinges being on the corridor side meant either that the man who installed the door had made a mistake or that the man who installed the door had not been hiding from anybody. He had been hiding for somebody. He had been keeping something safe, and he had wanted whoever finally found it to be able to get in. Hazel set the tip of the rebar against the bottom of the lower hinge pin and tapped it upward with the heel of her hand. The pin moved just a little. She tapped again. It rose another 1/4 inch. She worked at it for a long time. The light through the corridor windows went from white to gold to deep amber as the afternoon faded. Her hands began to ache. But the pins came up one at a time with the slow, stubborn cooperation of metal that has been holding still for 45 years and is finally being asked gently to let go. The last pin came free with a soft click. Hazel set down the rebar. She stood up. She put both hands on the edge of the door and pulled. The door was heavy. It moved. She walked it back slowly, hinge side first, until she could turn it sideways and lean it against the corridor wall. The opening behind it was dark. The windows in the room beyond had been covered from the inside with steel plates that had been welded in place. No light came in. The only light in the small room was the gold light spilling in from behind Hazel through the corridor windows, falling across the floor of the room in a long yellow rectangle. The rectangle of light landed on a wooden shelf. On the shelf in the exact center, set carefully on a small wooden stand, was a triangular wooden box with a glass front. Hazel stepped into the room. Inside the wooden box, folded into the perfect triangle that has been folded by the hands of military honor guards across this country for more than 2 centuries, was an American flag. Beneath the flag on a brass plate set into the front of the box were 3 lines of engraved letters. Walter J. Crane, 1st Infantry Division, Omaha Beach, Normandy, June 6, 1944. Hazel stood in the doorway of that small, dark room at the end of a forgotten railroad car, at the dead end of an abandoned spur in the woods of West Virginia, and she looked at the folded flag of a soldier who had crossed the English Channel under fire when he was 24 years old and lived to come home and work the railroad and raise a son and lose a son and wait alone for 31 years. The man in the photograph, her grandfather. She did not cry. Not yet. Crying was for later. Right now, there was only the long gold light falling across the floor of the sealed room, and the flag in its glass case, and the sudden full weight of an inheritance she had not known she was carrying until the moment it was placed in her hands. Behind the flag on the shelves that ran along both walls of the small room in neat rows, organized with the patient care of a man who had nothing but time, were dozens of cigar boxes, stacked from the floor to the ceiling, some big, some small, each one labeled in faded ink with a date. The earliest date was 1978. The latest date was 2002. Hazel Crane stood very still in the doorway of the room with the gold light of an early West Virginia evening falling on her shoulders, and she understood all at once that her grandfather had been waiting for her. She did not yet know how long. She did not yet know how much. But she knew this: he had not died alone after all. He had only died early. The light in the sealed room was changing as Hazel stood there. The sun was sinking behind the western ridge of the valley, and the gold rectangle on the floor was sliding slowly toward the back wall, getting longer and thinner as the angle of the light shifted through the open corridor windows. In a few minutes it would be gone, and she would be standing in the dark. She did not have a flashlight. She had not thought to bring one. She walked and back through the corridor, climbed down the vestibule steps, and walked out through the weeds to the gravel path. The light in the woods was the deep blue color it gets in the half hour before night, when the trees become silhouettes and the sky between the branches turns the color of an old bruise. She walked back to the gate, walked the half-mile down the gravel road to the highway, walked the mile back to Talcott. She found a small general store with a bell on the door, and an old man behind the counter who looked at her like a man who has seen everything. She bought a flashlight, 2 packs of D batteries, a candle, a box of matches, and a roll of paper towels. The total came to $17 and change. She paid with money she had been holding back for emergencies. She had not realized this would be the emergency. By the time she walked back to the railroad car, full dark had come down over the woods. The path was a tunnel of black trees, and the moon was a thin chip of bone above the ridge. Owls were calling from the deep woods. Hazel did not feel afraid. She felt instead like a woman walking back into a house that had been waiting for her. She climbed the vestibule steps a second time. She walked the long corridor in the beam of the flashlight. The light caught the brass fittings and made them flash. She walked into the sealed room. She set the flashlight on the wooden shelf beam pointing up at the ceiling so that the small room filled with a dim, diffused light, like the inside of a tent. She lit the candle and stood it on the shelf next to the flashlight. The room glowed, and she looked for the first time in good light at what her grandfather had built. The cigar boxes ran from the floor to the ceiling on both walls. There were so many of them she did not try to count. They were arranged by year oldest at the bottom, newest at the top. Some were ordinary cardboard boxes, the kind that came with 100 cheap cigars and a paper wrapper. Some were the wooden kind, the older kind with hinged lids and small brass clasps. The labels on the boxes had been written in pencil in a careful, blocky hand, with the year of the deposit on each one. Hazel reached for the lowest box on the left wall, the one marked 1978. She took it down. She sat on the floor of the small room with her back against the shelves. She set the box on her knees. She unhooked the brass clasp. She opened it. Inside the box were tightly rolled bundles of paper money held together with rubber bands that had dried to dust over the decades and crumbled apart in her hands when she touched them. The bundles fell open in her lap. $20 bills, $10 bills, a few fives. The bills had the older designs on them, the smaller portraits, the green that had faded to the color of the moss on the trees outside. The first bundle held $240. She set the box aside. She reached for the next one. 1979. $310. 1980. 480. 1981. 520. She kept going. The boxes from the early years were lighter. Fewer bills, smaller bundles. Walter had been making, $12,000 a year on the railroad in 1978. The deposits in those early boxes were what a man could spare from a working salary week by week, when he had nothing else to do with the money and nobody to spend it on. By the mid-1980s, the boxes got heavier. By the early 1990s, they were full. Some of the boxes did not hold paper money. Some of them held coins. Old silver dollars, heavy and cold, dated from the 1920s and 1930s. $50 from before they took the silver out. A box from 1989 contained nothing but small felt pouches, each pouch holding 3 or 4 gold coins of the kind that were sold by mail-order companies in the 1970s and 1980s as hedges against inflation. Walter had bought them quietly year by year, the way other men bought lottery tickets. The difference was that Walter's lottery had paid out. There were boxes that contained stock certificates from companies that no longer existed. Penn Central, Consolidated Foods. There were boxes that contained nothing but bank books, savings, passbooks from a dozen small banks across West Virginia and Kentucky, each one with a few $100s in it. The deposits made in cash. The accounts long since closed by death and time. Hazel counted for 3 hours. When she was finished, she sat on the floor of the room with her back against the shelves and her hands trembling, and she could not feel her feet. The candle had burned down by half. The flashlight beam still pointed at the ceiling. The total in paper currency was $38,400. The coins and the gold she could not value. She knew enough to know they were worth more than their face value because gold and silver in 2024 are worth many times what they were worth in 1978. She would learn later that the metal alone added another $14,000, but she knew none of that yet. She knew only that her grandfather, a man she had never met, had spent 24 years putting money into cigar boxes in a sealed steel room at the end of an abandoned railroad car, and that he had done it patiently, year after year, like a man who was leaving a long letter one sentence at a time, to a person he had no proof would ever come. On the bottom shelf behind the row of cigar boxes from 1978 and 1979, she found something the boxes had been hiding. It was an old metal lunchbox, the kind that had been sold in 5 and dimes in the 1950s and 1960s. Black with a curved lid, a small clasp on the front, and a thermos clip on the inside that had once held a thermos and now held nothing. Hazel picked it up. It was light. She set it on her knees. She unsnapped the clasp. She lifted the lid. Inside the lunchbox, folded once down the middle, were 2 sheets of lined paper covered in handwriting. Underneath the papers, face down, was a small black and white photograph. She looked at the papers. She looked at the photograph. The candle on the shelf flickered as a draft from somewhere moved through the corridor of the railroad car. Outside, an owl called once from the deep woods, and then was silent. Hazel took out the photograph first. She turned it over. It was Walter Crane standing in the same place where he stood in her mother's photograph, in front of the same railroad car in the same canvas jacket and the same railroad cap. But he was younger in this picture, maybe early 60s. The car behind him had been freshly painted the dark green, sharp and clean. The windows behind him were intact glass, clear brass fittings polished. He was looking straight at the camera with the kind of look that men of that generation had when somebody pointed a camera at them. Not a smile exactly, but a steady, sober readiness. There was somebody beside him in the photograph. A small boy. The boy was maybe 4 years old. He was standing beside Walter, holding Walter's hand with both of his small hands, and looking up at his father with the wide, unguarded eyes of a child who has not yet learned that the world will let him down. The boy in the photograph was Travis Crane, her father. Hazel set the photograph down very gently on the shelf beside the candle. Then she picked up the folded papers and she opened them, and she began to read. The handwriting was the same blocky, careful capital letters that had been on the cigar boxes. The paper was lined notebook paper, yellowed at the edges. The ink a faded blue-black that had been written with a ballpoint pen. The letter began without a greeting. It began the way men of his generation began things when they had something to say, and they were not entirely sure how to say it with the facts. It read, "My name is Walter Joseph Crane. I was born in this state on November 14th, 1920, in a coal company house in Cabin Creek that is no longer standing. My father was Otis Crane. He worked the mines for 31 years. In March of 1933, the bank in Charleston where he had put every dollar he ever saved closed its doors. He never got any of it back. He died in 1948 in a house he did not own. I was the only one of his children who lived to grow up. I went into the Army in 1942. I came out in 1946. On June 6, 1944, I waded onto Omaha Beach with the 1st Infantry Division at 06:30 in the morning. I will not write about that day. There is no point. You cannot write about a thing like that to a person who was not there. You can only carry it. When I came home, I went to work for the C&O Railroad. I started as a brakeman in the Hinton Yard in November of 1946. I worked 37 years. I never missed a shift. The yard supervisor in 1972 was a man named Hollis Webb, and he wrote a letter when I retired that I have kept in a drawer all these years. He said I was the most reliable man he had ever supervised. That is the only thing in my life I'm proud of besides my boy. I married Edna Mae Pickens in 1953. She was a school teacher in Talcott. She died of cancer in 1968 when our boy was 13. I raised him by myself for the next 4 years. I did the best I could. I was not a man who knew how to say the things a boy needs to hear. I could fix a brake assembly in the dark in the rain. I could not tell my own son that I loved him. That is the failure of my life, and I will carry it as long as I am still breathing. My son's name is Travis Owen Crane. He left this house on July 11th, 1972. He was 17 years old. He had gotten into trouble at the rail yard. There was a small theft. He was not charged, but he was ashamed, and we had words, and I said the wrong thing, and he was gone in the morning. He took $14 from the kitchen drawer and the canvas jacket I wore to work, and he left without saying goodbye. I have not seen him since. I am writing this in March of 1998. I am 77 years old. I bought this railroad car from the C&O in November of 1978 with my severance pay. They were glad to be rid of it. I welded the steel door at the end of the corridor myself in the spring of 1979. I've been putting money in this room ever since. I do not trust banks. I will not put my life's earnings in a place that closed its doors on my father. I have been saving this money for my son. If he comes home, it is his. If he does not come home but he had children, then it belongs to them. They are my blood. I have not seen them. I do not know their names. But I know this: a man's debts to the people who come after him do not go away just because he never met them. They get heavier. If you are reading this letter and your name is Crane, you are mine, and what is in these boxes is yours. There are no conditions on it. There are no rules. I lived a hard life, and I wanted the people who came after me to live an easier one. That is all. If you are reading this and your name is not Crane, then I am asking you plainly to find them, if they exist. The only thing I will ask of you is that. Find them. Bring them home. There are people in Talcott who will help you. Buck Holloway over in Charleston will help you. There are records at the courthouse in Hinton. The girl, if there is a girl, would be young still. She would not know any of this. She would not know I existed. I would like her to know I existed. I would like her to know that an old man on a dead end of railroad track in Summers County, West Virginia, kept his porch light on for 20 years. Walter J. Crane, Talcott, West Virginia. March 11th, 1998. Hazel read the letter through once. She read it through a second time. By the third time, she could not see the words anymore. She sat on the floor of the small steel room with the letter in her lap, and she lowered her face into her hands, and she made a sound that came up out of a place she had not known was inside her. It was not crying. It was something older than crying. It was the sound of a person finding out all at once that she had been loved by a stranger her whole life, that she had been an item on the prayer list of a man she had never met, that somewhere in the hills of West Virginia, while she was a baby in a trailer off Route 60 and while she was a little girl going to kindergarten in a hand-me-down dress, and while she was a teenager grieving her father, and while she was a young woman watching her mother die, an old man had been sitting alone in a house at the end of a road in a town she had never heard of, and he had been thinking about her. He had not known her name, but he had been thinking about her. She cried for a long time. She cried for him. She cried for her father who had carried his shame for 51 years and had taken it to his grave. She cried for her mother who had carried something else. Some piece of this story that Hazel did not yet understand. She cried for herself, 22 years old, holding a letter that had been written in 1998 by a man who had died in 2003 in a sealed room in a railroad car in the woods, 2 days into the rest of her life. And she understood for the first time what Buck Holloway had meant when he said, "It's not time." It was time now. Hazel slept that night on the bench seat in the first sleeping compartment of the railroad car. She put on every piece of clothing she had and pulled her jacket over her like a blanket. The cold inside the car was deep and steady the way the cold is inside any unheated steel building in February in the mountains. But she slept hard. She slept the way a person sleeps when they have stopped running. She woke up in the morning to the sound of birds in the woods and a thin gray light coming through the corridor windows. She sat up. She looked around. The compartment with its torn upholstery and its dust-covered brass fittings was the most beautiful room she had ever woken up in. She walked into Hinton that morning and bought breakfast at a diner and used the diner's phone to call a number she had carried in her head for 2 years. When Buck Holloway answered, she said, "Buck, it's Hazel." There was a pause on the line. Then Buck said very quietly, "Where are you, child?" She said, "Hinton." "Hinton." "Yes, sir." Another pause, longer this time. She could hear him breathing. He said, "I'm leaving Charleston in 20 minutes. There's a Hardee's on Route 3 just east of town. You wait for me in the parking lot. Don't move." She said, "Buck, don't move, Hazel." The line clicked. She walked to the Hardee's. She sat on the curb in front of the building. She watched the trucks come in off the interstate and pull through the drive-thru. The morning was cold. Her breath made small clouds. An hour and 40 minutes later, Buck Holloway's old red Chevy Silverado came down the road and pulled into the parking lot. He got out without shutting the door behind him. He walked across the parking lot in his work boots and his flannel jacket. He did not say hello. He did not say her name. He walked up to her and he put his arms around her the way an old man puts his arms around a child who has come back from a place she should not have been. She had not been hugged in 2 years. He held her for a long time. He did not say anything. He smelled like coffee and motor oil and the faint, clean smell of laundry soap. The smell of a man who lived alone and took care of himself. When he stepped back, his eyes were red. He said, "Get in the truck." She got in. He drove them across the road to a small park that overlooked the New River. He parked. He shut off the engine. He did not get out. He sat with both hands on the steering wheel and looked at the river. He said, "You found him." She said, "I found his railroad car. I found the room. I read the letter." Buck closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them. He said, "Tell me his name. Out loud. I need to hear you say it." "Walter Joseph Crane." Buck nodded. Once, slowly, like a man finally allowed to put down something he had been carrying. He reached over and opened the glove compartment. He took out an envelope. The envelope was old. The paper was the color of weak tea. It had been folded twice and pressed flat, and there was a soft circle of wear on the front where something inside had been pushing against the paper for a long time. He held the envelope in his lap. He said, "Your mother gave me this in March of 2020, 2 years before she passed. She came into the truck stop on a Tuesday morning. She brought me a coffee. She sat down at the counter and she handed me this envelope and she said, 'Buck, I might not have the chance to tell my girl what I should have told her. If anything happens to me, I want you to hold on to this. And when she's old enough, when she's strong enough to walk through it on her own 2 feet, without it breaking her, you give it to her.'" Buck swallowed. She said, "I'll know if it's time. And if I'm not here, you'll know." He looked at Hazel. "I should have given you this the day you finished paying me back. I almost did. You walked into my office that day and you laid down the last $20 bill and I sat there and looked at you and I thought, she's not strong enough yet. She's still a kid. She'll break. And so I let you walk out. And then they took your trailer and then you were gone and I was holding this envelope in my desk drawer all those long months, not knowing if I was ever going to see you again. I would open the drawer some mornings just to look at it. I would close it again. I would tell myself you would come back. Most days I did not believe it." He held the envelope out. His hand was shaking very slightly. "I made a mistake, Hazel. I've been a coward about this. Your mother trusted me and I held this back from you. And I was wrong. But I want you to know that I did not hold it back to keep you from anything. I held it back because I was afraid for you. I am old. I have known a lot of strong people. And every one of the strong ones got their share of breaks before they got their share of strength. I did not want to be the one who handed you a break too early." Hazel took the envelope. It was lighter than she had expected. Buck said, "Open it now." I'm not going anywhere. I will sit right here as long as you need." Hazel opened the envelope. Inside the envelope were three things: a folded letter, a small brass key with a number stamped on the head of it, and a single index card with a hand-drawn map on one side and a typed address on the other. The address read Birch Lane Spur, 1.1 miles east of Talcott, West Virginia. Pullman Standard 1946. Seal compartment rear bulkhead. Key fits the inner padlock. Hazel held the key in her palm. It was warm from being inside the envelope. It was the size of a dime and the color of an old church bell. She unfolded the letter. It was 3 pages. The handwriting was her mother's. She knew it the way a person knows their own face in a mirror. The handwriting was slightly more careful than usual, the way handwriting gets when a person is writing something they know they will only get one chance to say. It began, "Hazel, my baby. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and Buck Holloway has decided that you are old enough to know what I have spent your whole childhood being too afraid to tell you. I am sorry. I want to start with that. I'm sorry I did not tell you these things while I was alive. I was a coward, baby. I have been a coward about this for 20 years, and I have run out of time to fix it. So I am writing it down, and I am asking your forgiveness in the same letter. And I am hoping that when you are done reading this, you will understand the why of it, even if you cannot forgive the how. Your father's name was Travis Owen Crane. He was born in Talcott, West Virginia on August 4th, 1955. His father was Walter Crane. His mother was Edna May. His mother died when he was 13 years old of a cancer that nobody in his family ever spoke about, because in their world you did not speak about it. Your father was raised after that by his father alone in a small house at the end of Birch Lane in Talcott. Your father loved his father. I want you to know that. He loved Walter the way every boy loves his father. In that part of the country, silently, completely, and without any way to say it. When your father was 17, he got into trouble at the railroad yard where his daddy worked. He took a few dollars from the foreman's office. It was a foolish thing. He was a teenager and the world had been hard on him, and he made a foolish choice. The foreman did not press charges, but your father was ashamed. He came home that night and he and his daddy had words. Walter said something and Travis said something back. And Walter said something he meant and something he did not mean. And Travis was gone in the morning before sunrise. He told me once, only once, that the only things he carried out of that house in Talcott were a few dollars from the kitchen and his daddy's old work jacket. He hitchhiked west the next morning. He never went back. He never wrote. He never called. He carried what he had done with him for the rest of his life. He was 17 years old. He never went home. I met your father in 1994 at a diner in South Charleston. He was 39 years old. I was 26. He was the kindest man I had ever met, and the saddest. He never spoke about his daddy. He never spoke about Talcott. The first time I asked him where he was from, he looked at me and he said, "Honey, I am from where I am standing. That is the only place I am from now." And he never said anything more about it. We married in 1995. I knew nothing about his family. Nothing. He had no pictures, he had no letters, he had no people. He came to me out of nowhere, and we built a life out of nothing, and he was a good husband and a wonderful father. And the only thing he ever asked of me was that I never ask him to talk about where he came from. I broke that promise once. In the summer of 1995, 3 months after we got married, I was cleaning out the closet in the back bedroom of the apartment we were living in then. I found an envelope in the bottom of one of his old work bags. The envelope was addressed to him at a post office box in Charleston. The return address said Walter Crane, Talcott, West Virginia. I knew right then that the envelope was from his daddy. The letter inside was very short. It said, "Son, I am sorry. Come home if you can. The door is open. Daddy." The letter was dated March of 1995. 3 months before. Your daddy had received it, and he had not opened it before he hid it in his work bag. The seal had been broken, but the letter had only been folded once. He had read it. He had put it away. He had not answered it. I wrote a letter to Walter Crane that summer. I did not tell your father. I wrote to him, and I told him my name, and I told him that I had married his son, and that his son was alive, and that his son loved him but could not bring himself to come home. I asked him if there was anything he wanted me to tell Travis. I asked him if there was anything he wanted me to do. He wrote back 2 weeks later. His handwriting was shaky. He did not ask me to do anything. He did not ask for anything. He thanked me for letting him know. He said he was a good boy. Tell him I loved him when the time comes. I would not impose on him now. He has made his life. Let him have it. That was all. He sent me a small brass key with a second letter that fall. He did not explain it directly. He only said that it fit a lock at the end of an old railroad car parked in the woods near Talcott, and that if I ever decided his granddaughter should know the place, I should give her the key. I never used it. I never told your father about it. The key has been in my jewelry box for nearly 30 years. I am giving it to you now, baby. The door is yours. The lock may not even hold anymore, but the key is yours by right. In June of 2002, when you were 8 months old, I drove to Talcott. I had told your father I was visiting my cousin in Charleston. You were asleep in the car seat in the back. I drove past the post office and the church, and I found Birch Lane, and I drove down it, and I parked across the road from his house. I sat in my car for 45 minutes with you sleeping behind me. I watched him through the front window. He was sitting at his kitchen table. He was reading a newspaper. He was alone. I could not get out of the car. I wanted to. I had brought a photograph of you, baby. I had wrapped it in a piece of nice paper, and I had put it in my purse. And I had been planning to walk up to that man's door and put it in his hand and tell him that he had a granddaughter and her name was Hazel, and she had his eyes. I could not do it. I drove home. I cried the whole way. I am writing you this letter, baby, because I was a coward, and because that man died in 2003 without ever seeing your face, and because I cannot fix that now, and because I do not want you to have to be afraid the way I was afraid. Buck Holloway has the key. He has an address. He has a map. When you are ready, when Buck thinks you can stand it, he will give you these things, and you will go to that place, and you will see what your grandfather left for you, and you will know that you were loved by a man you never met. You were loved by him from the moment I told him you existed, and you were loved by him until the day he stopped breathing. Forgive me, baby. I should have driven you to that house. I should have walked you up to that door. I am sorry. Be brave for both of us. Mama Hazel set the letter in her lap. She did not cry. The crying had been used up in the railroad car the night before. There was something else now. Something quieter. Something that was less a feeling and more a sense of standing on a piece of solid ground for the first time. She handed the letter to Buck. He read it slowly. When he finished, he folded it and put it back in the envelope and handed it back to her, and he wiped his face with the back of his hand. He said, "Your mother loved you more than her own life. She just got afraid. People do." Hazel said, "I want to know about him. I want to know everything you know." Buck looked out the windshield at the river. He said, "I was hoping you'd ask." Buck started the truck. He pulled out of the park and drove slowly along the river road. He said, "My daddy worked the C&O Railroad with Walter Crane for 26 years. They started together in 1946 in the Hinton Yard. They came out of the war the same year. My daddy was Navy. Walter was Army. They never talked about the war. Most men of that generation didn't. They just came home and went to work and tried to live the rest of their lives without ever using up another minute of luck." Hazel listened. The road wound along the river. The morning was bright and very cold. My daddy used to say Walter was the most reliable man he ever knew. He would say it like other men say a prayer. Walter Crane never missed a shift in his life. That was a thing my daddy would say at the dinner table when he wanted to teach me something about being a man. Walter Crane goes to work. Walter Crane shows up. Buck shook his head slowly. When Walter's wife died in '68, my daddy and a few others from the yard rotated dinners over to him for about 6 months. They'd take a casserole or a stew, drop it on the porch, knock on the door, leave before he could come out. Walter would not have accepted help if you handed it to him directly. He was that kind of man. So they handed it to him sideways. They left it on the porch. He brought the dishes back washed. Nobody ever spoke about it. Hazel asked, "What was he like?" Buck thought about it. Quiet, tall, real lean the way men get who don't eat much and work outside their whole life. He had hands like leather. He had an old C&O cap he wore everywhere even after he retired. I remember seeing him in the cap on Saturday mornings at the diner in Talcott when I was a young man. He'd sit at the counter and drink 1 cup of coffee. He'd read the paper. He'd nod at folks who came in. He didn't say more than 10 words to anybody. He just sat there, like a man waiting for a train that wasn't coming. He paused. That's exactly what he was, I guess, now that I say it out loud. Hazel said, "Did he ever talk about Travis, about my father?" Buck shook his head. "Not to me. Not to my daddy, far as I know. Not to anybody. After your daddy left in '72, Walter never said the boy's name again. Not in public. Not where anybody could hear. He went to work the next day. He kept going to work. He worked another 6 years and then he retired. He bought that railroad car and he started doing whatever it was he was doing in there. And folks thought he had finally lost his mind a little, and they let him alone, and that was that. Buck was quiet for a moment. I think now, looking back, that he didn't lose his mind at all. I think he was the only man in town who knew exactly what he was doing. I think every dollar that went into one of those boxes was an apology. I think he was building year by year the only thing he had left to give. He could not write his son a letter the boy would open. He could not get his son back. So he started saving. He saved like a man digging a well, in case it ever rained again. Hazel said he wrote a letter, ma'am. In 1995, he wrote a letter to my father. My mother found it. She was the one who wrote back. Buck nodded slowly. So he did try. I never knew. I'll be. He drove for a while. He said, "You know what your granddaddy did the morning of December 20th, 2003? He got up at 5:30 in the morning. He made coffee. He got dressed. He put on a clean shirt. He drove down to the Talcott post office and he mailed a Christmas card to a post office box in Charleston addressed to Travis Crane. The post office box had been closed for 9 years. The card came back 2 weeks later marked, Return to Sender. Walter never saw it. He died at his kitchen table on December 22nd, 2 days after he mailed it. Heart gave out. The mailman found him on the morning of the 23rd when he came up the walk to deliver a circular and noticed the porch light was still on. Hazel was quiet. Buck pulled the truck off onto the shoulder of the road. He put it in park. He turned and looked at her. "Honey," he said, "your granddaddy did not die alone. He died waiting. There is a difference. I want you to hear that difference. You go up there and you see what he built, and you understand that the man was waiting for you the whole time, even before he knew you existed. He was waiting for somebody, and he believed in his bones that somebody would come. That kind of faith does not get rewarded very often in this world. But you came. You walked up that path and you opened that door. And you came. And whatever you find in those boxes, that is the only ledger he was keeping. He balanced it. He balanced it the only way a man like that knew how." Hazel looked at Buck. She said, "Will you come up there with me?" Buck nodded. He said, "I would be honored." They drove up to Talcott together that afternoon. Buck parked his truck at the gate. They walked the gravel path through the woods. Hazel watched Buck as he walked. He was a man in his 60s, but he walked the path with the steady rhythm of a man who had walked through every kind of woods his whole life. When the railroad car came into view at the end of the spur, he stopped. He did not move for a moment. He took off his cap. He held it in both hands. He said very quietly, "Hello, Walter." He stood there for almost a minute. Then he put his cap back on. Hazel showed him the inside of the car. She showed him the corridor and the compartments and the steel door at the end. She showed him the small sealed room and the cigar boxes and the flag in the wooden box. Buck looked at the flag for a long time. He did not touch it. He said, "First Infantry, big red one." He never told a single soul in this county he was at Omaha. Not a soul. He shook his head. "Hazel, your granddaddy came up that beach when he was 24 years old. The big red one was the first wave. The first wave on Omaha was the worst part of any battle in any war in this country's history. He came home from that and he went to work in a rail yard, and he worked 37 years. And he never once asked anybody to tip a hat to him for what he had done. That is the kind of man he was. Buck stayed at the railroad car for 2 hours. He helped Hazel light a small fire in the clearing outside the vestibule in a ring of stones somebody had built a long time ago. They ate sandwiches he had brought in a cooler in his truck. They talked. In the late afternoon, while they were sitting on the vestibule steps drinking coffee from a thermos, Hazel heard footsteps on the gravel path through the trees. She stood up. A small white-haired woman was walking up the path. She was using a cane. She was carrying a covered casserole dish in her free hand. She walked slowly, but she walked steadily. And when she came into the clearing, she stopped, and she looked at the railroad car for a long moment. And then she looked at Hazel, and she smiled. "You'd be the granddaughter," she said. Buck stood up. He took off his cap. He said, "Mabel." The old woman nodded at him. "Buck Holloway, I haven't seen you in a long time." She walked up to Hazel. She held out the casserole dish. The dish was warm in Hazel's hands. The smell of beef and onion and biscuit crust came up out of it. "My name is Mabel Whitfield," the old woman said. "I'm 87 years old. I have lived in Talcott since I was a baby. My husband James worked the railroad with your granddaddy for 30 years. He passed in 1991. Walter helped me bury him." Mabel looked Hazel in the face. Her eyes were the color of pale river water. They had not lost any of their sharpness. "I heard yesterday at the post office that a girl named Crane had walked into the clerk's office in Hinton and bought Walter's railroad car. I thought to myself, well, Mabel, you better get on up there with a casserole. So I baked you one this morning. I am sorry it took me a day." Hazel could not speak. Mabel sat down on the vestibule steps next to Buck. She set her cane across her lap. She said, "I have something for you, child. I have been keeping it in a drawer for 26 years. I always thought somebody would come. I'm very glad it was you." She reached into the pocket of her coat. She took out a small leather wallet. She opened it. Inside the wallet, behind a clear plastic sleeve, was a black and white photograph the size of a playing card. She handed it to Hazel. The photograph was of Walter Crane. Walter, at maybe 40 years old, lean and dark-haired in a railroad work jacket. He was crouched down, holding a small boy's hand. The boy was about 5 years old. He had Walter's serious eyes and his mother's soft mouth. Behind them, in the background of the photograph, was the entrance to the Big Bend Tunnel, the great black mouth of it cut into the side of the mountain with the rails running into the dark. The boy was Travis Crane. Mabel said, "I took that picture in 1960. We were having a picnic. James and Walter and Edna May and Travis and me. Travis was the only child of his generation in our circle. We all loved that boy. Walter loved him in a way that did not have a word for it." She looked at Hazel. "When that boy left, your granddaddy did not speak for a year. Not a single word. He came to my house on a Sunday in the spring of 1973. And he sat at my kitchen table and he drank a cup of coffee. And he stood up and put on his cap and went home. And he had not opened his mouth the whole time. James and I cried about it that night. We thought he was going to die of it." She paused. "He did not die of it. He just got quieter. And then he bought that railroad car and he started doing whatever it was he was doing, and we let him do it. We knew he was working on something. We did not know what. We did not ask. He was a man who deserved his privacy." She reached over and put her small, thin hand on Hazel's wrist. "I am very glad you came, child. I have been waiting a long time." Hazel held the photograph. The photograph showed her father at 5 years old, holding her grandfather's hand in front of the great dark mouth of the Big Bend Tunnel. She said, "Thank you, ma'am." Mabel smiled. She said, "Eat the casserole while it's warm." They ate the casserole on the vestibule steps as the light went down through the trees. Mabel stayed for an hour. Then Buck drove her home down the gravel road, and he came back, and he and Hazel sat in the railroad car for a while longer in the lantern light. And then he drove back to Charleston for the night, and Hazel slept again on the bench seat in the first compartment, and the woods around the railroad car were quiet, and the only sound was the wind moving through the high branches and the occasional small voice of an owl far off in the dark. For the next 3 weeks, Hazel lived in the woods. She slept in the railroad car. She walked into Hinton every other day for groceries. She paid for them with money from one of the cigar boxes. She bought a sleeping bag and a small camp stove and a kerosene lantern. She bought work clothes at a thrift store. She bought a pair of leather gloves and a hatchet and a roll of plastic sheeting. Buck came up on the weekends. They cleared brush. They walked the spur track end to end and made a list of what needed to be done. They were quiet together. They worked. The trouble came on a Wednesday afternoon in the 4th week. Hazel was sweeping out the corridor of the railroad car when she heard a vehicle coming up the gravel road. She stopped. She listened. The engine sound was wrong. Not a pickup. Not Buck's old Silverado. Something heavier. Something newer. She walked out to the vestibule. A black SUV had pulled up to the gate at the end of the gravel road. 2 men were getting out. One of them was wearing a dark wool overcoat. The other one was wearing a suit. The man in the overcoat was holding a leather folder. They walked up the path to the clearing. The man in the overcoat was about 50 years old. He was lean and well-groomed in the way that men with money are well-groomed, the way that signals from 100 yards away that this is a person who pays attention to the cut of his collar. His hair was very dark and slicked back. He had a smile ready when he came into the clearing, the kind of smile a man uses on people he intends to take something from. He said, "Miss Crane." Hazel did not answer. The man held out his hand. "My name is Curtis Whelan. I'm with Whelan Holdings out of Charleston. This is my attorney, Marcus Riley. I wonder if we might have a few minutes of your time." Hazel did not take his hand. She wiped her hands on her jeans. She said, "What do you want?" Curtis Whelan's smile did not move. His eyes did. They went a little colder. He said, "Miss Crane, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. The land you're standing on, the 200 feet of track this railroad car is sitting on, it belongs to my company." Hazel did not say anything. Curtis Whelan opened his folder. He took out a sheet of paper. He held it up so she could see it. "This is a quitclaim deed dated March of 2010, by which the successor entity to the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway transferred the land underneath this spur, including the rail bed, and the surrounding 3/4 of an acre to my holding company in exchange for a payment of $45,000. The deed is recorded with the state of West Virginia. It's a matter of public record." He smiled again. "I had no idea the railroad car was being sold off until I read about it last week. Apparently, the auction at the county level didn't account for the fact that the underlying land was already in private hands. That happens sometimes when the railroads dispose of equipment. They don't always check the chain of title on the parcel." Hazel still said nothing. Curtis Whelan tilted his head slightly. "I'd like to be reasonable about this, Miss Crane. The car is yours. I have no interest in the car. What I have interest in is the land. I'm prepared to offer you a relocation payment of $2,000 if you'll agree to vacate within 30 days. Frankly, $2,000 is more than the railroad car is worth. You'd come out ahead. I can have the paperwork drawn up by the end of the week." He held the paper out. Hazel did not take it. She looked at his face. She had seen men like Curtis Whelan her whole life. They came into the truck stop in their good cars and their good coats. They left small tips. They were polite to her face and contemptuous to her back. They were a kind of man this country had a long history of producing, and an even longer history of letting get away with what they wanted to get away with. She said, "I'll have my attorney call yours." Curtis Whelan blinked. The smile faltered for the first time. "Miss Crane, there's no need to involve attorneys. This is a simple matter of property law. I'm offering you—" "I heard you." He looked at her for a moment. The friendliness slid off his face. What was underneath it was not unfriendly exactly. It was just the empty, quiet face of a man who had stopped pretending. He had a thin mouth and very dark eyes and a small white scar at the edge of his jaw. He said, "Miss Crane, I would think very carefully about this. You have 30 days. I'm being generous. After that, you'll be removed by the sheriff." Hazel said, "Get off my property." He smiled again. It was not the same smile. "This is my property, Miss Crane. That is the entire issue. You have until the end of next month." He turned. He walked back down the path with his attorney behind him. They got into the black SUV. They drove away. Hazel stood on the vestibule steps in the late February light with a broom in her hand, and she watched the dust settle back down on the gravel road where they had been. She said out loud to nobody, "Like hell." Hazel drove into Hinton the next morning in Buck's truck, which he had loaned her for the week, and she walked into the Summers County Courthouse and asked for the deed records office. The clerk pointed her down a long hallway. She walked down the hallway. She found a small office with a counter and a sign that said, "Records of Deeds and Land Transfers." There was a man behind the counter, 60 years old, with reading glasses on his head and a sandwich on a paper plate next to his keyboard. She said, "I need to see the deed history on a parcel. The old C&O spur a mile east of Talcott, the part the Pullman car is sitting on." The man looked at her over the top of his glasses. He was the kind of West Virginia public servant who had been doing his job for 30 years and was not impressed by anybody. He said, "How far back?" "As far as you've got." He nodded slowly. He stood up. He walked into the back room. He came back 40 minutes later with 3 large books bound in green cloth. He set them on the counter. He said, 1947 forward is in the green books. Earlier than that, you'd have to go to the State Archive in Charleston. We don't keep it here." Hazel sat down at a small table in the corner of the office and opened the first book. She did not know what she was looking for. She knew only that Curtis Whelan had said his deed was from 2010 and that he had paid $45,000 for the land. That was a small amount of money for a piece of property in West Virginia, even a worthless one. Either he had gotten a very good deal, or he had bought something that the seller did not actually own. She read deeds for 4 hours. The light through the high window of the office turned the same gold color it had turned in the railroad car on her first night. And her eyes ached and her back ached, and she did not stop. She read every deed listed under the C&O Railway and its successors for the parcel that ran from the highway up the spur into the woods. She read the deed for the original 1873 grant of the right-of-way. She read the consolidation deed of 1928 when the C&O reorganized. She read the abandonment notice of 1978 when the spur was decommissioned. And then, in the third book on a page she nearly turned past, she found it. A deed dated October 14th, 1985. Grantor Estate of Hollis Webb, deceased by executor Margaret Webb of Charleston, West Virginia. Grantee Walter Joseph Crane of Talcott, West Virginia. Property, that certain parcel of approximately 0.78 acres, comprising the abandoned rail spur known as the Birch Lane Spur, formerly held by the C&O Railway, including all rights of way, all real property, and all improvements thereon, including the Pullman Standard sleeping car, identified as serial number 4781. Consideration: $4,200. Hazel read the deed 3 times. Hollis Webb, the yard supervisor in 1972. The man who had written Walter the letter when he retired. The man who had said Walter was the most reliable man he had ever supervised. Hollis Webb had died in 1984. His widow, as executor of his estate, had sold Walter the spur and the railroad car in 1985 for $4,200. The deed had been signed, witnessed, notarized, and recorded with the county clerk on October 17, 1985. Walter Crane had not been squatting on railroad land for 45 years. He had owned it. He had owned it since 1985. Curtis Whelan's quit-claim deed of 2010 from the so-called successor to the C&O was not worth the paper it was printed on. The C&O had not owned the land in 2010. They had not owned it since 1985. They had sold it to a man named Hollis Webb in 1973, and Hollis Webb had sold it to Walter, and Walter had owned it until he died. And when he died with no will and no living heir on file, the land had passed into a kind of legal limbo, waiting like everything else Walter Crane had ever owned for the right person to come and claim it. Hazel had the clerk make her 3 certified copies of the 1985 deed. She paid for the copies. She walked out of the courthouse into the cold March sunlight. She got into Buck's truck. She drove back to Talcott with the certified copies on the passenger seat next to her. And she felt for the first time in 22 years the particular hard, clean weight of being right. She did not yet know what was going to happen in court. She did not yet know that Curtis Whelan had done this kind of thing 4 times before, in 4 other counties, and was about to face a great deal more than a quiet eviction case. She did not yet know that her grandfather had left her one more thing hidden in the wall of the railroad car behind a panel that she would not find for another 6 weeks. She knew only this. She had a deed. She had her grandfather's letter. She had her mother's letter. She had a flag folded into a triangle in a wooden box on a shelf at the end of a long corridor. And she had Buck Holloway and Mabel Whitfield in a small town in the hills of West Virginia that had been waiting in its quiet way for the granddaughter of Walter Crane to come home. She drove back along the river road with the windows of the truck cracked open and the cold March air on her face, and she did not turn on the radio. She just drove. She listened to the engine. She listened to the river. She listened somewhere underneath both of those sounds to the long, faint voice of an old man who had spent 31 years keeping a porch light on for a son who never came, and who had finally at last gotten his answer. The hearing was set for the third Tuesday in April, in the small courtroom on the second floor of the Summers County Courthouse in Hinton. Buck Holloway drove Hazel down that morning in his old red Silverado, and he wore a clean white shirt that he had ironed himself the night before, and a gray sport coat that he had not put on in 11 years. The coat smelled faintly of cedar from the closet where it had been hanging. Hazel wore a navy blue dress that Mabel Whitfield had insisted on lending her. The dress was 40 years old. It still fit. Mabel had said, "I wore it to my Jim's funeral. It is a dress that knows how to stand up in a hard room. You wear it, child." They parked behind the courthouse at 8:45. Buck shut off the engine. He sat with both hands on the steering wheel and looked at the brick wall of the building. He said, "I spoke to Harold Briggs last night. He's already inside." Hazel said, "All right." Buck looked at her. "You don't have to talk in there, Hazel. Harold can do all the talking. That is what he is paid for. You sit at the table next to him and you let him handle it." Hazel said, "I'm going to talk." Buck nodded slowly. He had known she was going to say that. He had said his piece anyway, the way men of his generation said their piece, knowing it would not change anything but feeling obligated to put the words on the record. He said, "Then I will tell you one thing. When you get up there, you do not look at Curtis Whelan. Not once. You look at the judge. The judge is the one who matters. Curtis Whelan is a man who lives or dies by your attention. You give him none. You understand." Hazel said, "Yes, sir." They got out of the truck. The courtroom was small and old and smelled like furniture polish in the dust of 100 years of paper. The walls were painted the color of weak coffee. The bench was raised at the front, and a state seal hung behind it on the wall. 8 rows of wooden pews ran down the room. The pews creaked when you sat in them. Curtis Whelan was already seated at the table on the right side of the aisle. His attorney was beside him, Marcus Riley. The same suit from the day at the railroad car. Curtis was wearing a dark gray suit and a maroon tie and the same slick-back hair. And when Hazel walked in, he turned his head and looked at her with a small, thin smile. Hazel did not look at him. She walked to the table on the left. Harold Briggs was waiting. He stood up when she arrived. Harold was 71 years old. He had been a country lawyer in Charleston for 46 years. His office was over a hardware store on Capitol Street, and his desk was covered in stacks of files, held together with rubber bands, and his suit was 20 years out of style and beautifully pressed. He had taken Hazel's case for a flat fee of $1,000 when Buck had called him, and he had said on the phone, "I knew Walter Crane's name. My uncle worked the railroad with him. I will not take a penny more than the filing costs." Harold smiled at Hazel. He pulled out her chair. She sat down. He leaned over and said quietly, "You ready?" She said, "Yes, sir." The judge came in at 9:03. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s named Judge Erskine Holcomb. He had been on the Summers County bench for 19 years. He looked at the courtroom over the tops of his glasses the way a man looks at a stack of paperwork on his desk, and he said, "Be seated. We're going to keep this moving. Whelan Holdings versus Crane. Both parties present. Mr. Riley, you may proceed." Marcus Riley stood up. He talked for 15 minutes. He laid out the quitclaim deed. He produced certified copies. He referenced statute. He made the case sound on the surface of it like a tidy commercial dispute. He said my client has been more than reasonable. He said Miss Crane was a good faith bidder at a railroad auction. But unfortunately, the underlying parcel was not part of that auction. He said we are seeking only the relief of vacating the land. He sat down. Judge Holcomb looked at the table on the left. He said, "Mr. Briggs." Harold stood up. He buttoned his coat. He said, "Your Honor, I have a brief response, but with the court's permission, I would prefer that my client be the one to present the central evidence in this matter. She found it. She did the work." The judge's eyebrows went up slightly. He said, "Miss Crane." Hazel stood up. Her legs were shaking. She felt this and she ignored it. The dress was very straight on her shoulders. The dress, which had stood up in a hard room before, was standing up now. She said, "Your Honor." Her voice came out clear. She had not expected that. She had expected a small voice. She said, "My name is Hazel Crane. I'm 22 years old. I bought the Pullman car out behind Talcott from this county at auction in February for $10. I had nothing else. That was all the money I had in the world, and I bought a railroad car with it, because I did not know at the time that the man who once owned it was my grandfather." The courtroom was very quiet. She said, "When Mr. Whelan came to my property at the end of February and told me that the land underneath the railroad car belonged to his company, I did not know what to do. I am not a lawyer. I have never been in a courtroom in my life. I had been homeless 3 months ago. I had $10 to my name 3 months ago. I did not think there was any way I could win against a man with attorneys." She paused. She did not look at Curtis Whelan. She looked at the judge. She said, "But I went to the courthouse here in Hinton and I asked for the deed records on the parcel. And I sat at a table in that office for 4 hours and I read every deed in 3 green books. And I found this." She picked up a folder from the table. She handed it to Harold. Harold handed it to the bailiff. The bailiff handed it to Judge Holcomb. "That is a certified copy of a deed dated October 14th, 1985, by which the estate of Hollis Webb conveyed the parcel in question, including the spur track and all improvements thereon, and the Pullman car identified by serial number, to my grandfather Walter Joseph Crane, for the sum of $4,200. Hollis Webb was the C&O yard supervisor in Hinton until his death in 1984. He had bought the parcel from the railroad in 1973 when the spur was decommissioned, and his widow sold it to my grandfather in 1985. She paused. My grandfather owned that piece of land for 18 years before he died. He never told anyone in Talcott about it. He was not a man who told people about his business. When he passed in 2003, he had no will and no heir on file with this county. The parcel sat in his name. It sat in his name for 21 years. She took a breath. It is in his name today, Your Honor. The C&O Railway did not own that land in 2010 when Mr. Whelan claims he bought it. They had not owned it for 25 years. The deed Mr. Whelan is presenting to this court is a deed for property the seller did not have the right to sell. She set her hands flat on the table. I am Walter Crane's only living grandchild, Your Honor. My father was his son. His son left home at 17 and never came back. And my grandfather waited the rest of his life. He left me a letter. He left me everything he had. And he left me that land. I'm asking this court to recognize what has already been on the record at the Summers County Courthouse since 1985, which is that the land underneath that railroad car belongs to my family. It always has. She sat down. The courtroom was completely silent for what felt like a long time. Judge Holcomb was reading the deed. His eyes moved across it slowly. He turned the page. He read the back. He set it down. He looked at Marcus Riley. He said very quietly, Mr. Riley, did your client conduct a title search prior to filing this action? Marcus Riley stood up. The smooth, practiced look on his face had cracked just slightly at one corner. He said, Your Honor, we relied on the documentation provided by my client at the time of the original transaction in 2010. We had no reason at that time to... Mr. Riley, I asked you a question. There was a long pause. Marcus Riley said, Your Honor, a title search was not performed at the time of the original transaction. It was deemed unnecessary. The judge looked at him over the top of his glasses. He said, Deemed unnecessary by whom? Marcus Riley did not answer. The judge looked down at his bench for a moment. He picked up a pen. He set it down. He looked up. He said, I am going to take a recess. I want 15 minutes. Mr. Riley, I want a private word with you and your client in chambers before we proceed. He stood up. The courtroom stood up. He walked out. What happened in Judge Holcomb's chambers during those 15 minutes? Hazel never knew exactly. She and Buck and Harold sat in the courtroom. They did not speak. Buck got up once and walked to the back of the room and stood looking at a portrait of a former judge on the wall. He stood there for the entire 15 minutes. He was a man Hazel was learning who could stand very still for a very long time when the moment called for it. When Judge Holcomb came back in, Curtis Whelan and Marcus Riley came in behind him. Curtis Whelan's face had changed. The smooth wax of it had been peeled back. Underneath was a man who looked older than he had looked an hour before, and a great deal more tired. Judge Holcomb sat down. He arranged his papers. He looked at the courtroom. He said, It is the finding of this court on the documentary evidence presented and on representations made by counsel during recess that the deed presented by Whelan Holdings as the basis of this action is invalid. The parcel in question is, and has been since October of 1985, the property of Walter Joseph Crane, and by uncontested lineal descent, his granddaughter, Miss Hazel Crane. The petition is denied. Costs to the petitioner. He set his pen down. He looked at Marcus Riley. He said, "Mr. Riley, there is one other matter." Harold Briggs leaned over to Hazel. He whispered, "Watch this." Judge Holcomb said, "It has come to the attention of this court that your client has been the petitioner in 4 similar actions in 3 other counties of this state in the past 9 years. Each of those actions was based on quitclaim deeds executed by an entity claiming successor interest to defunct railroad companies. In each of those cases, the underlying parcel had previously been transferred to a private owner, and the chain of title had not been examined. 2 of those cases resulted in default judgments for your client when the original property holders failed to appear. In one of those cases, an elderly widow lost the home she had lived in for 41 years. Curtis Whelan was staring at the table in front of him. He was not moving. The judge continued, "This court has this morning contacted the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of West Virginia. Federal investigators have expressed interest in the pattern of these actions. I would expect, Mr. Whelan, that you will be hearing from them shortly." He paused. "I would also note for the record that I have personally spoken to Judge Whitcomb in Raleigh County and Judge Davis in Mercer County concerning their files in the previous matters. They have agreed to forward those files to the federal investigators." Marcus Riley's mouth was slightly open. Judge Holcomb looked at the bailiff. He said, "We are adjourned." He stood up. He walked out. Outside the courthouse on the sidewalk in the cold, bright April light, Hazel Crane stood on the steps and watched 2 men in dark coats walk up to Curtis Whelan beside his black SUV and ask him very politely to come with them. They put a hand on his elbow. They did not put him in handcuffs. They did not need to. He went with them the way a man goes with the inevitable, which is to say with no resistance at all, because resistance had already been used up somewhere back along the road, and he had not noticed at the time. Buck stood beside Hazel. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "Your granddaddy would have liked the way that played out." Hazel said, "Would he?" Buck said, "He was not a man who needed to win loud. He just needed to win right. That was right what just happened. That was right enough that he would have nodded once and gone back to reading his paper." Harold Briggs came down the steps behind them. He shook Hazel's hand. He said, "Miss Crane, you can go home. The land is yours." Hazel said, "Thank you, Mr. Briggs." He smiled. He said, "Walter would have been very proud of you, young lady. I never met him, but my uncle did, and my uncle was a good judge of men." He shook Buck's hand. He walked off down the sidewalk toward Capitol Street. An old country lawyer in a 20-year-old suit, going back to his office over the hardware store where the desk would be covered in files and the windows would be open to the river air. Buck and Hazel got back in the truck. They drove east toward Talcott. They did not turn on the radio. The river ran beside them all the way home. Spring came early in the valley that year. By the first week of May, the dogwoods were blooming along the gravel road, and the redbud trees were throwing their soft purple flowers against the deep green of the new pine. Hazel was at the railroad car every day from sunrise until dark, and the work of restoring it became for her a kind of prayer. that did not require any words. She started with the floor. She pulled up the rotted carpet in the corridor and the compartments. Underneath, she found tongue and groove white oak, original to the car, dirty but undamaged. She rented a sander from a shop in Hinton. She sanded the floor by hand for 6 days, working on her knees in a dust mask, with the corridor windows open to the spring air. The wood came up the color of honey. When she put the first coat of finish on it, the grain rose up out of the boards like a memory rising into a face. She insulated the walls with rigid foam panels she cut to fit the curve of the steel sides. Buck came up on weekends and helped her install them. Buck had spent 10 years in his 20s as a finished carpenter before he bought the truck stop, and his hands remembered the work. He showed Hazel how to hold a coping saw. He showed her how to read a level. He showed her how to set a screw without stripping the head. He did not teach her by lecturing. He taught her by working beside her and letting her watch. He said once while they were eating sandwiches on the vestibule steps, "Your daddy should have taught you these things. I'm sorry he did not get the chance." Hazel said, "He did not know them, Buck. He left home before his own father could teach him." Buck nodded slowly. He said, "Then we are going to fix that piece of it as we go." Walter would have wanted his granddaughter to know how to read a level. She paneled over the foam with thin pine boards she stained dark to match the original mahogany. She polished the brass light fixtures in vinegar and salt for 3 days until the green tarnish dissolved and the metal glowed warm and gold again. She cleaned the mahogany walls with Murphy oil soap, working in small sections, watching the wood come back to life under her cloth. In the 3rd week of May, she dug a 400-yard trench by hand from a limestone spring she had found uphill from the spur to a small water tank she built on a wooden platform beside the railroad car. The work took her 9 days. Her shoulders ached every night. She lay on the bench seat in her compartment and felt the muscles in her arms moving under her skin in ways they had never moved before. She slept hard. She woke up and did it again. A man named Tucker Lemons, who ran the hardware store in Hinton and who had become a friend, helped her install a small solar panel array on a steel rack he welded for her behind the railroad car. 4 panels. A battery bank in a weatherproof box mounted under the chassis. It was not much power. It was enough. Lights. A small refrigerator. A radio. A phone charger. She turned the kitchen compartment into a real kitchen. A 2-burner propane stove. A sink with running water from the spring. A counter she made from a slab of cherry wood that a logger from down the road named Eldon Pace gave her after she helped his wife move a pile of brush. The cherry slab was 4 feet long and 1.5 inches thick. And when she sanded it and oiled it, the grain ran through it like fire under water. She kept the cigar boxes. She cleaned them one at a time. She arranged them on a shelf above the kitchen counter, labels facing out, organized by year, the way Walter had organized them. Some of them she filled with new things now. Tea bags, matches, packets of seeds for the garden she was planting, small tools, a pair of reading glasses she had bought herself, but she left 3 of them empty. 3 of the older boxes, the wooden ones with the brass clasps, sat on the highest shelf with nothing inside them. She did not put anything in them. She did not know exactly why. She thought, if she thought about it at all, that an empty container is its own kind of message. It says there is room here. It says the work is not finished. It says the next thing is still coming. By the end of June, the railroad car was a home, a real home, the first real home Hazel had ever lived in. She had a bed made up with clean linen in the rear compartment. She had a wood stove in the front compartment, vented through the roof with flashings she had installed herself with Buck watching over her shoulder. She had 2 armchairs from a yard sale reupholstered by Mabel Whitfield, who had insisted on doing it as a housewarming gift, and who had spent 4 afternoons in her own living room with a needle and a length of dark green fabric humming hymns while she worked. She had a small bookshelf made from the wood of a cherry tree that had fallen across the spur in a storm. She had filled the bookshelf with books she had bought at thrift stores. Louis L'Amour, John D. MacDonald, The Old Man and the Sea, a Bible that Edith had given her in the bus station in Huntington a lifetime ago. On the kitchen shelf above the cigar boxes, she had set 3 photographs in plain wooden frames. Walter Crane in 1981, standing in front of the railroad car. Walter and Travis at the mouth of the Big Bend Tunnel in 1960. Margaret in a yellow dress on her wedding day in 1995. Smiling at the camera with the whole untold future still ahead of her. Below the photographs on a small wooden stand sat the triangular wooden box with the folded American flag. Hazel looked at it every morning. She did not yet know what she was going to do with it. She knew only that her grandfather had carried it home from a beach in France in 1944, and that she would not let it sit unhonored. She found the second lunchbox on a Thursday afternoon in the first week of July. She was tearing out the last section of rotted wall paneling at the front of the corridor, the section closest to the vestibule. The paneling had been water damaged from a leak in the roof that Buck had patched the previous weekend. She was prying off the boards one at a time and stacking them in the clearing outside. The third board came off, and she saw behind it a small dark space inside the wall. The space was the size of a shoebox. Tucked inside it, wedged tight against a wooden cross brace, was a black metal lunchbox, the same kind as the first one. Hazel set down her pry bar. She reached in and pulled the lunchbox out. It was light, lighter than the first one had been. She walked with it back through the corridor to the kitchen and set it on the cherry counter and stood there for a moment looking at it. Then she opened it. Inside was a single small notebook, black cover, spiral binding, the kind of notebook a man would carry in the breast pocket of a work shirt. The pages were filled with Walter's blocky, careful handwriting. She sat down at the kitchen counter. She opened the notebook to the first page. The first page was dated January 8th, 1980. It read, Charlie Reams, $42. Wife in the hospital in Beckley. 3 kids. Foreman laid him off in November. He needs help and will not take it from anyone. I left the money in his mailbox in an envelope this morning before sunrise. He will not know it was me. The second page was dated February 14th, 1980. It read, Pearl Acres, $60. Husband killed in the mine in '76. Has been making it on his pension and nothing else. Heat went out in her house last week. I left the money under her front mat in cash. The mat had snow on it. She would not have looked under it for a few days, long enough to forget I had been there. Hazel read the third page, the fourth, the fifth. Each page was a name, a date, an amount, a short note explaining who the person was and why they had needed help. Some of the entries were $5, some were $200. The largest entry on a page dated November of 1989 was $450 given to a young widow named Effie Caudle, whose husband had been killed in a logging accident and whose homeowner's insurance had refused to pay because the policy had lapsed 11 days before the accident. The entries continued through the 1980s, through the 1990s, into the 2000s. The last entry was dated October 22, 2002. It read, Donnie Pruitt, $80. Came back from the second Gulf without a leg. VA dragging its feet on the disability paperwork. I left the money in an envelope at the post office to be held for him at general delivery. He will not know who left it. That was the last name. After that, on a fresh page in a steadier hand, was a final entry. It was longer than the others. It was undated, but the ink looked the same color as the entries from 2002. It read, If you are reading this, you have found my second lunchbox. I am sorry I did not put it next to the first one. I hid it because I was afraid you would think less of me if you saw it. I did not want to look like a man who was bragging. I have never told another living soul about any of these names. They are not anyone's business. But I am writing them down because I am old now, and I will not be here much longer to remember them. And I do not want their stories to die. The money in the boxes in the back room was always for my own family first. It was for my son if he came home and for his children if he had any. That is the truth, and I will not pretend otherwise. But there was always more than my family would need. I figured that out around 1979. A man does not need $50,000 in a railroad car. A man does not need that even for his children. Money past a certain point is just weight. So I started giving some of it away, quietly, the way it should be done. If you have found this notebook, you have already found everything else. You have what you need. There is more here than one person should keep. A man's worth is not what he keeps. It is what he leaves behind for the people who come after. I am asking you plainly to keep the work going. I do not care how. I do not care for who. There are good people in these hollers who will never ask for a thing in their lives, and they will need help anyway. And you will know them when you see them. Find them. Help them. Do it the way I did it if you can. Quietly. Without your name on it. Let it be the only good thing in their day, and let them never know who put it there. The world has enough loud kindness. What it does not have enough of is the quiet kind. Walter J. Crane, 2002. Hazel sat on the high stool at the cherry counter for a long time. She read the final entry 3 times. 3. Outside the railroad car, the late afternoon light was coming down through the trees, the way it had on her first night. The long gold rectangle moving slowly across the clearing as the sun fell behind the western ridge. A thrush was singing somewhere in the deep woods. The air was full of the smell of warm pine and the river on the other side of the highway. She closed the notebook. She set it on the counter beside the first lunchbox, which was on the shelf with the cigar boxes in a place of honor. She thought about the 47 names. She thought about the porch lights. She thought about a man in a railroad cap walking year after year in the early gray hours of the morning along the back roads of Summers County and Raleigh County and Greenbrier County. leaving envelopes under doormats and in mailboxes and at general delivery windows of small post offices, and never once telling anyone what he had done. 47 names, 47 mornings, 47 small and invisible kindnesses scattered across 22 years of the ordinary, unrecorded life of an old man in a small West Virginia town. She thought I am going to keep the work going. She thought I do not yet know how. But I am going to. She closed the lunchbox. She set it on the kitchen counter. She walked out into the clearing in front of the railroad car and stood there in the long gold light. And she looked at the trees and the rusted bumper at the end of the spur and the ivy on the side of the car and the dogwoods in the sky. And she said out loud to her grandfather and to whatever else was listening, all right then. She started the fund in August. Harold Briggs helped her with the legal work. He filed the papers in Charleston. He set it up as a small private charitable trust, registered with the state with Hazel as the sole trustee, and Buck Holloway and Mabel Whitfield as advisory board members. She put $15,000 of Walter's money into it as initial capital. She named it the Walter J. Crane Memorial Fund for the Working People of the Appalachian Counties. The mission, as she wrote it on the single sheet of paper that constituted the fund's bylaws, was this: to provide quiet, anonymous, no-strings-attached financial assistance to working people, retirees, widows, and veterans in the rural counties of southern West Virginia who are facing temporary hardship and who would not otherwise ask for help. Disbursements shall be made in cash by hand without ceremony. Recipients shall not be required to apply, fill out forms, demonstrate need, or thank the donor. Confidentiality shall be absolute. She did not put her own name on anything. She did not put Walter's name on anything that would be visible. The fund had no website. It had no phone number. It had no office hours. What it had was Buck Holloway, who knew everyone in 3 counties, and who knew which families were quietly going under, and which families were too proud to ask for help, and who had over 40 years of running a truck stop, become a kind of unofficial intelligence network for the slow, private suffering of working people in central West Virginia. What it had was Mabel Whitfield, who knew every widow in Talcott and Hinton and the small, unincorporated communities up the hollers, and who knew which ones had lost their husbands, and which ones had lost their savings, and which ones were this winter choosing between the heat and the heart medicine. What it had was Hazel Crane, who walked back roads in the gray hours before dawn, leaving envelopes in mailboxes and under doormats, working from a list that grew longer every week. In the first 6 months of the fund's operation, 22 envelopes were left. The first envelope went to a man in Meadow Bridge, whose welding shop had burned down in a freak grease fire in early September. He had no insurance. He had a wife and 2 grown children and a granddaughter he was raising. The envelope contained $600 in cash and a single folded note that read, "From a friend you do not know. Do not look for me. Use it well." He never knew who left it. The second envelope went to a widow in Hinton whose furnace had quit working 3 days before the first cold snap of October. Buck had heard about it from her cousin who came through the truck stop. The envelope contained $400. It was enough for the repair plus a tank of fuel oil. She found it under her doormat on a Tuesday morning. She stood on her porch for a long time holding it. She did not know who had left it, But Mabel told Hazel later that the woman had walked into the church the following Sunday and put a $5 bill in the offering plate, which she had not done in 2 years, and that she had been crying quietly the whole service. The third envelope went to a young veteran in Mercer County. The fourth went to an elderly couple whose son had died of an overdose and who were now raising 2 grandchildren on Social Security. The fifth went to a school custodian in Hinton whose wife had cancer. The sixth, the seventh, the eighth. Hazel kept a notebook. She kept it in her kitchen in the second lunchbox on the shelf with the cigar boxes. She wrote down each name, each amount, each date, each short story. She wrote in her own handwriting, which was nothing like Walter's, and she put the notebook beside his notebook on the shelf. And the 2 notebooks sat there together in the lantern light of the railroad car at night, like a conversation that was finally being continued after a 22-year silence. In November of 2024, on a Saturday morning, Buck drove a man named Earl Childers up the gravel road to the railroad car. Earl was 67 years old. He had worked the C&O Railroad as a track maintenance man for 39 years. He had retired in 2017, and his wife had died of a stroke in 2019. And he had been living alone in a small house in a holler outside Hinton ever since. The county had condemned his well that summer. He could not afford to have a new one drilled. He had been hauling water in plastic jugs from a public spigot at the county park for 4 months. Buck had heard about it from the county clerk's husband at a fish fry. He had told Hazel. Hazel had said, "Bring him up. Don't tell him why." Buck pulled up in front of the railroad car. Earl Childers got out of the truck. He stood in the clearing, an old man in a clean flannel shirt holding his cap in both hands, looking at the railroad car with the wide, quiet eyes of a man who has not seen anything new in a long time. Hazel walked down the vestibule steps. She held out her hand. She said, "Mr. Childers, my name is Hazel Crane. I'm Walter Crane's granddaughter. Buck tells me you knew my grandfather." Earl Childers blinked. He said, "Walter Crane was my supervisor for the last 8 years before he retired." Hazel smiled. She said, "Then come on inside. I have coffee on, and a friend of mine and I would like to talk to you about your well." She walked back up the steps. Earl Childers followed her. He looked back once at Buck, who had stayed in the truck. Buck nodded. Earl Childers walked into the railroad car. He looked at the kitchen. He looked at the cherry counter. He looked at the photographs on the shelf. He saw Walter's photograph. He stopped. He took off his cap. He said very quietly, "I'll be." Hazel handed him a cup of coffee. She said, "Sit down, Mr. Childers. Tell me about your well." A year passed. It was October again. The leaves on the hills around Talcott had turned, and the valley was full of the long, slow gold light that comes down through that country in the second and third weeks of October. The light that has been coming down through those hollers for 10,000 years. And that does not particularly care whether anyone is watching it. Hazel was 23 years old. She had been living in the railroad car for 19 months. The fund had given out 41 envelopes by then, 41 quiet mornings, 41 names in her notebook. The triangular wooden box with the folded flag had been sent in May to the National Cemetery at Quantico, Virginia, where it now sat in a glass case in the Visitor Center near the memorial to the 1st Infantry Division. There was a small brass plate beside it. The plate read, Walter J. Crane, 1st Infantry Division. Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944. Returned by his granddaughter Hazel Crane. He came home. In place of the flag on the shelf in the railroad car, Hazel had hung a framed letter. It was the letter Walter had written in March of 1998. The letter she had found in the first lunchbox. She had had it framed at a shop in Beckley. She read it sometimes, not often. She did not need to read it. She had it by heart. On a Sunday morning in the second week of October, Hazel was sitting on the vestibule steps of the railroad car with a cup of coffee. The sun had just come up over the eastern ridge. The clearing was full of the long horizontal light. The dogwood at the edge of the clearing was the color of old blood. The maple beside the railroad car had turned the color of beaten copper. The air smelled like wood smoke from her stove and fallen leaves and the faint iron tang of the old rails under the weeds. She was wearing a flannel shirt that had been Walter's, which Mabel had given her the month before. The shirt was 40 years old. It had been hanging in a closet in Mabel's house since 1991. Mabel had said, "I should have given this to you last winter. Jim took it off Walter's clothesline one Saturday in 1990 by mistake. Walter laughed about it and told him to keep it. I want you to have it." The shirt was too big in the shoulders. Hazel did not care. It smelled faintly the way old fabric in a cedar closet smells of wood and time, and a man who had once worn it to work. She heard a vehicle coming up the gravel road. It was a truck. She knew the engine. Buck Holloway pulled up to the gate and shut off the truck. He got out. There was somebody with him in the passenger seat. A woman. Hazel could not see her clearly through the windshield. Buck walked through the gate and up the path. The woman got out and followed him. She was young, about Hazel's age. She had a backpack on one shoulder. She was wearing a thin coat that was not warm enough for October in the mountains. She looked tired in the way that Hazel knew tired looks. The tired of someone who has been moving for a long time without anywhere to stop. Buck came into the clearing. He took off his cap. He said, "Hazel, this is Cassie Stiltner. I met her at the truck stop yesterday. She's been on the road a while. I told her about your place." Cassie Stiltner stood at the edge of the clearing with her backpack on her shoulder, and her eyes very large. She did not speak. Hazel knew that look. She had worn that look. The look of a young woman who had walked through a door once before in some other life and had not been allowed to stay. Hazel stood up. She set her coffee cup on the vestibule step. She said, "Cassie, come on in. There's coffee on the stove. We can talk about what comes next after." Cassie Stiltner did not move. She said very quietly, "I don't have any money." Hazel said, "I know." Cassie said, "Buck said you might have a place I could stay for a while I figure things out." Hazel said, "I do." Cassie's eyes filled up. She said, "I don't know how to thank you." Hazel walked down the vestibule steps. She walked across the clearing. She held out her hand. She said, "Cassie, my grandfather built this place a long time ago, for somebody he didn't know yet. He waited for them his whole life. I came along late. He didn't get to meet me. But he left enough room in this place for the people who come after me, too. You are one of those people. There is nothing to thank me for. You are home." Cassie put her hand in Hazel's. The two young women walked across the clearing in the October light. Buck stood by the gate with his cap in his hand. He watched them go. He did not move for a long minute. He was looking at the railroad car and the dogwood and the maple and the long gold rectangle of light coming down across the rusted spur, and the two young women walking up the vestibule steps together. From somewhere across the highway on the other side of the river, the long, low whistle of a freight train moving east through the Big Bend Tunnel rose up through the trees and rolled across the valley and faded. Buck put his cap back on. He walked and back to his truck. He drove away down the gravel road toward Talcott, and the highway and the long Sunday afternoon and the railroad car sat in its clearing in the woods. And inside the railroad car in the kitchen, two young women sat at a cherry counter and drank coffee and began to talk. And the work that an old man in a railroad cap had started in 1979 went on the way good work goes on quietly without anyone keeping score. In the small, unrecorded mornings of a country that does not always remember its own best people, but is held up in the end by exactly that kind of person. A girl had bought a railroad car for $10. She had thought she was buying a place to sleep. What she had bought, it turned out, was the rest of her life, and the lives of the people who would come up the gravel road behind her, year by year, looking for somewhere quiet to start over. The river ran on. The hills turned in their slow seasons, and on a shelf in a railroad car at the end of an abandoned spur in Summers County, West Virginia, 3 photographs and 2 notebooks sat in the lantern light of a long October evening, and the granddaughter of Walter Crane went on writing names in a book that her grandfather had begun, and the line of the family that had nearly ended in 1972 went on in a way nobody could have predicted, by going forward into all the strangers who were not yet strangers, all the friends who had not yet arrived, all the porch lights that had not yet been turned on for someone who needed them. Walter had kept his porch light on for 31 years. His granddaughter would keep hers on for the rest of her life. That was the inheritance. That was what she had bought. $10 and the rest of her life in a kind of quiet that some men spend a whole lifetime building so that the people who come after them will know when they finally walk up the path that they were always expected. They were always wanted. They were always from the beginning on their way home.